either you are distorting the flow of information that's coming in, or what often happens with social anxiety, you're not getting a flow of information because you're avoiding eye contact. So this was, I sucked so much at making, at making friends. And it took me years to realize that I just didn't make eye contact when I was meeting new people. I would look down. And so, number one, that's pretty off-putting to other people. And number two, if you're just looking down, what information are you getting about the other person? You're not getting facial expression. You're just getting tone of voice, and you're not making much of a connection. So your information is mostly the weird you're not making floating in your head, which is they don't like me, I'm weird, all that sort of stuff. So eye contact is a huge problem with social anxiety, and people often don't get the information they need. And the last thing to add to this that I forgot to mention earlier, Dr. K, is it doesn't have to start with a seed of anxiety. It can start with a situation, and we can kind of debate if is that a seed of anxiety, but it can start with some type of thought about a future situation you have to be in. It can start with a just finding yourself in some kind of social situation. So it could be something is actually happening and you start to feel anxious, and then all this whole process occurs. But it can also be you're at home sitting on the couch and thinking about this thought just pops up in your head, like, oh my gosh, I have to go to do that thing on Saturday. And then this whole process unloads. I've worked with a few people here and there who don't really get much of the physical symptoms at all. It's all the thoughts. And we can kind of debate is that actually true or not. I think that's more of an academic exercise, but it can go that way too, where it starts, you're just at home, you're not even in a social situation, and now you become activated with social anxiety.
Yeah, so that's thank you for those clarifications. I think what I would kind of how I would sort of round that out a little bit, or just I think you had mentioned this, kind of add this back in, maybe is a better way to put it, is then that does lead to a performance drop.
Yes.
And so when I think about a lot of these, like a lot of mental illnesses, like I think that the challenge is that once your performance actually drops, you get some very strong real data to feed your anxiety.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because they did make fun of you. Some of them did laugh. And then kind of like you said with the looking down, like it almost becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're afraid that it's hard for you to make friends. And then the way that you respond to that, the way that you cope with that, the way that you protect yourself from that, right? So I'm not going to look people in the eye. I'm going to look down. And then sure enough, over time, it's going to be hard for you to make friends. That just feeds the social anxiety.
And that's where I don't develop the skills of making social connection.
Absolutely.
You keep doing that, your skills become compromised, and then over time you do get not invited to things.
Yeah, and I think that's so, listening to you talk about it, it's so interesting to think about, in a sense, like how hopeless this sounds, because this goes wrong and this goes wrong and this goes wrong and this goes wrong. But my kind of experience, and I'm sure yours is somewhat similar, is that like if you really think about it, you need a lot of things to perpetuate this cycle.
Yeah.
Right? And if you can change any one of those things, so sometimes when people come in, they're like, oh, all of these things are falling apart and it's some vicious cycle. The cool thing about a cycle is that you can stop any one point.
Right.
And so kind of like you said about, some of your patients don't experience a whole lot physiologically. Some of them are a lot more cognitive in nature. And that's been something that's been kind of like hopeful to me, is that if someone has a very intensive physiologic sensation, that can be something that we can intervene on. We don't have to fix all the trauma of the past. We don't have to fix all that. We can just start somewhere. And then oftentimes, like, it almost is like a house of cards in terms of progress.
Yeah.
So this was a big part of where I trained, but we used to say, all boats rise together.
Yes.
So
yes.
when everything is falling apart, and I did a lot of my training in a general hospital.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were at Columbia. I don't know how, but we would do a lot of medical things too. And what we'd find is that someone's fibromyalgia, their anxiety, even their like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, like all of these things would get better or worse together. And it can feel so overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I'm noticing that there's a lot of places that you can kind of intervene.
Absolutely. That's what's very hopeful about all of this.
So
yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to share a story. I know the exact day where my relationship with social anxiety completely changed. So I was taking a public speaking class, not intentionally. I thought I signed up for this class thinking we were going to study famous public speeches. Like we're going to watch Martin Luther King, JFK. We're going to watch these speeches and dissect them and write essays on them. And I'm like, that class sounds cool and fun. And then I show up and my teacher, Miss Hayes, says, welcome to public speaking, where you're going to face your fear of social situations, which freaked me out. I tried to drop the class. I went to the office, figured out how to drop the class. And the guidance counselor said, all you need to do is ask the teacher's permission and get this signed, and then you can drop the class. But then I was too socially anxious to ask the teacher to drop the class. So I avoided it. And I thought in my head, somehow I will make it through public speaking without having to publicly speak. Like somehow I will avoid this. So the class had a bunch of older students. I was a freshman in high school. And it had one student who, he was the coolest guy. I wanted to be just like him. He had the cool hair. He had the cool clothes. He had the swagger to him, this confidence. I wanted to be this guy. And one of the very first assignments we got paired up in groups of 3. And it was me, the cool guy, and someone else. And we had to give like a 2-minute talk on a topic we knew something about. Just like impromptu, just with each other, with the small group. He went first. He gave...
Of course he did.
Of course he did. He gave this amazing talk. Like, I was on the edge of my seat. And I was just excited to be, like, breathing the same air as this guy, right? He was charming. He was cool. He was collected. And then right after that, we had to debrief. And we had to say the things that were going on in our head. And the moment he finished, the smile disappeared. It's almost like this mask was taken off. And he said, the whole time I thought, I'm not making any sense. I sound like an idiot. I looked at Ali and I thought Ali was just looking at his watch and was so bored by what I was saying. Like he started saying all the things that I believed about myself. I'm weird, strange. No one's interested in this. People are bored. And his thoughts did not match up to the experience I had. And so what I started to connect the dots here were, or the dots I started to connect was, if he's having those thoughts and this is the performance he had, and I'm having these thoughts and I'm thinking I'm weird, he's thinking he's weird, do we all just think this? Like, this is where I started to believe that thoughts really don't matter, and people don't really like when I say this. And to qualify it a little bit more, most anxious thoughts don't matter. And they don't matter because they're the same damn thing. Every time you're in a social situation, you're thinking you're weird, dumb, strange, people are not interested. If a weather app is telling you the exact same prediction for every day, that's a crappy weather app because things change. Social situations change. But if your mind keeps telling you the exact same thoughts, those thoughts are bullshit. They don't matter. And so what becomes important is recognizing, oh, it's that same pattern over and over again. I don't need to listen to this pattern. This is my anxiety. This is what it does. It always does this in this situation. This is not new information. This is not specific to this context. This is very common in this context. So I don't need to listen to this. That's what I learned in that situation, and that changed my life. That 2 minutes of time completely changed my entire life.
Yeah, so that's so interesting to hear, right? So I'm kind of thinking about, I'm going to take the role of my patients with social anxiety for a second.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say, well, yeah, you think those thoughts don't matter because they're wrong for you, but they're right for me.
Right.
People do. I did jump into the pool, and I jumped in with my socks on, and that's like I genuinely do stupid things.
Yeah.
And so when someone, you know, like you said, people will sometimes take issue with that. I get where you're coming from, but you know, when someone pushes back against that, what do you say to them? How do you approach them?
Yeah,
Right? Like,
I would say that.
If you're a normal person, I agree, but I'm not a normal person.
Right. I would say this, that there are absolutely times where people are going to laugh at you. There are absolutely times where you're going to embarrass yourself. There are absolutely times where you're going to be humiliated. You're going to say the wrong thing. People are going to judge you. That is a part of being a human. That is a part of being a social animal. When you struggle with social anxiety, you get so focused on that you start believing that this is what happens all the time. And what we have to do in treatment and the content that I make is to help people get really comfortable with being in those situations, with understanding their anxiety, getting good at it. And what I mean by that is learning how to experience it, learning what happens, and then living beyond the anxiety, where you understand it, you recognize it, and you're able to create experiences that get you real world data on what actually happens. And what actually happens, a small percentage of people think you're an idiot. A small percentage of people think you're amazing. Most people just don't care. That is the harsh reality here, is most people are completely neutral about you. Not you and me. People, if you're on YouTube and Twitch, people have, there's fans and there's haters. And we've got our fans, we've got our haters. But for most people just don't care. Most people are completely neutral about you. And the trick with social anxiety is, I cannot tell you that, Dr. K. You have to experience it and live it yourself. One of the ways we think about anxiety now is this idea of the inhibitory learning model, which is your mind highly prioritizes emotional experiences. So fear, things like that, right? And your mind it's an association machine. It connects things together very quickly, very easily, and it prioritizes emotional information. So for people with social anxiety, ambiguous, mostly neutral faces get paired up with threats, danger, get out of there, escape, avoid all that, right? I can tell you all of these things. It doesn't matter. Your mind needs to experience it and live it itself. And the way that happens is we have to engineer social situations that get you real world data that surprise you. When your mind is surprised that I expected this thing to happen, I expected people to judge me for this, and you know what? Most people don't actually care. Like, I have now done this exercise 20, 30 times, and sometimes people are like, what the hell are you doing? But most of the time, people just shrug it off and they don't care. Oh, interesting. When your mind is surprised, that is when these associations can begin to change. That's when they might be inhibited. That's the whole idea of inhibitory learning model, is you're learning that these fears actually don't need to be activated in these situations. I wish I could just tell you these things. I can't. They have to be something that you experience on your own.
Yeah, so it's so interesting to hear about that moment of surprise, right? So sometimes in psychotherapy, like we'll focus on like catharsis,
Yeah.
and in these moments, right, where you didn't realize, and I think the subjective feeling of surprise, I'm sure, is neuroplasticity. So like
Yes.
when our brain becomes neuroplastic, what we experience is actually surprise.
Yeah.
And I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about kind of treatment approaches. I think we're kind of talking about, how to fix it. So I'm really curious about, so you're a psychologist, right?
Mhm.
And so what are the treatment approaches? Like, how do you approach patients? Like, are there particular modalities? Like, you seem a
Yeah.
little bit more cognitive behavioral oriented
Yeah.
to me, just like talking to you and listening to you. But I'm super curious about, how do you approach working with patients?
Yeah. I really prioritize, like, just personally, the most important thing to me is my relationship with the people I work with. If you don't have a place where there's warmth and compassion and understanding, you've got nothing, right? But I think that's like any good therapist. Like,
I think that's what common factors research shows. I don't know if you've
yeah,
dug into this stuff, but
totally,
yeah.
totally, right? Like, at the end of the day, that's all we've got as a therapist. So that's step one, is work with someone who listens with compassion, right, and understanding. And this is also true, by the way, of I often get questions from family members or friends, like my brother, my friend, my partner has social anxiety. Like, how can I help them? The first thing is warmth and listening. Don't say it's all in your head. That is the dumbest thing to say to anyone who is in any way struggling with any kind of mental health issue. Yes, everything's in our head. Everything is in our head. It's that's how your nervous system works, right? That's is just the dumbest thing you can ever say. And don't say don't worry about it. Don't say it's not a big deal or you're overthinking. Don't dismiss, but approach with curiosity. Like, what is this like for you? And that is the biggest problem with anxiety. Anxiety is so invisible. People don't see it. You often see the effects of ADHD. You often see the effects of being in the autism spectrum, having some type of struggle with learning or reading. With depression, you can sometimes see the effects of it, either irritability, low mood, not really anhedonia, not experiencing pleasure. You're going to see changes in the way people are interacting, or maybe their daily living has gone down. They're not getting out of bed. They're not taking care of themselves. There's signs of many mental illnesses. There are not that many signs of anxiety. They often are invisible. Sometimes you see avoidance. People aren't doing the things that might be socially expected of them. Presentations, social situations, they find ways of getting out of it. But sometimes you don't see that avoidance. All the distress, impairment, all the symptoms are all internal. They're all hidden.
That's so interesting, right? Because you said sometimes you see avoidance, but by definition, you can't see because the avoidance is the absence of something.
You might,
right?
It might be someone who's trying to figure out a way to not give that presentation.
Yeah. And that's kind of exactly what I'm saying is like when I think about it, right? So it's like people are like, what you see is an absence of something. It's the negative space.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So it's not like a
positive. Weird way to think of. Yes.
Yeah. No. But I mean, I think that's what makes it so invisible because you're not going to notice. And when I work with people who, especially have social anxiety, it's crazy like how good they get at being invisible.
Absolutely. And no two people with social anxiety look alike. You can have someone who looks incredibly charismatic and is deeply socially anxious. You can also have someone who cannot have eye contact at all and is looking down and speaks very softly and is more the stereotype of social anxiety. Both of those, I've had that in my waiting room, where my 3 o'clock, gregarious, handsome, charismatic, deeply socially anxious, my 4 o'clock, quiet, looking down, cannot have contact with anyone, socially anxious. Both those things are absolutely true, right? But I like phrasing it that way, that it is this like negative space that we're looking for,
Yeah.
and most people won't see it. So to get back to treatment, we need warmth, compassion, and understanding, because we're not seeing what it's like for the other person. We can't make those assumptions. We need to understand what it's like. And that's where I'm very much a behaviorist. For me, the most important thing is function. Like, what is this social anxiety? What is this social anxiety doing for you? What is the function of it in your life? What is the function of these thoughts? What is a function of this behavior? And what I mean by that is, if you're avoiding, what kind of situations are you avoiding? There might be a theme there. So some people might be avoiding performance situations. Performance, you might think of a musician or an athlete, but it also can involve writing in public. It can also involve using a public restroom. It can also involve eating in public. Like, those things can feel performative, and that someone gets anxious and then they can't perform those actions in those situations. The social anxiety could also be, the theme of it could be about conversations, initiating a conversation, maintaining it, stopping it, and leaving. Those are huge. Those are huge. Some people, I feel so bad for these folks whose social anxiety is about ending conversations. They're the people at networking events who end up trapped in a terrible conversation and can't get out of it until someone comes in and rescues them. Sometimes that person is me. And the social anxiety is about, stopping and saying like, hey, I have to go. And these are the people that end up staying at an event for hours longer than they ever wanted to, because they were too anxious to stop and leave, right? Sometimes the theme to it could be just about spontaneously generating something to say. I've seen that often, where there's a latency to respond. And what that just means is there's a lag, there's a delay. Someone asks you something, your mind goes blank, you're flooded with anxiety. It's like what I had is with selective mutism, but it happens with adults. And you can't say something. And then usually what happens, someone else swoops in. People don't wait for you. They talk over you. Now you feel like you've just been taken advantage of, or now you feel like people think you're dumb, don't know what to do, stuff like that. And sometimes another theme can be assertiveness, saying no when someone asks you to do something you don't want to do. Or it could be about asking for help. I see this a lot, especially with the young adults I work with, is they might fall behind in something and they're too anxious to ask for help. And now the problem snowballs. It becomes this bigger thing. So warmth, compassion, understand what is a social anxiety doing for you? What's the function of it? How is it trying to protect you? What's the theme of it? And then the most critical question I ask, I don't often ask it like this, but I ask it of myself, is what do you need to learn? What do you need to learn? Some people need to learn that they can tolerate rejection. Some people need to learn how to initiate a conversation. Some people need to learn some people need to learn what to do when they're flooded with anxiety. One patient I worked with, and this will get a little bit down into the weeds of social anxiety treatment. Let's do it. One of the best ways to treat social anxiety is in social context. It's a social problem. It needs to be treated in a social situation. So again, if I'm just working one-on-one with a patient, they don't really, if I tell them, you know what, you did pretty good in that conversation, I understood everything, it makes sense. It doesn't matter, Dr. Ali, I'm paying you. I know you're going to say these things about me. Not 100% true. Like, I am going to give you honest feedback once we're at that point in our relationship. But the point is valid that this is not a normal social situation. They need to get that feedback in a real life social situation. And the best way to treat it is in a social anxiety group where real people led by an expert is creating the type of social situations that are maximizing learning, maximizing those surprise aha moments, right? When there's a sense of safety that people can authentically share, amazing things can happen in that social anxiety group. But long story short, I had a patient who, anytime she was in that social anxiety group, she would start crying and would run out. And so I realized what this person needs to learn is how to bring down that intense distress in the moment so they can then be focused on the social situation. So everyone has to learn something different. We worked on a lot of distress tolerance skills, and then that patient was able to participate in that group, repeated that group, and ended up becoming one of the social anxiety group all-stars. She would organize get-togethers for the people in the group where they would have coffee afterwards and continue doing the exercises in the local neighborhood. It was amazing. But everyone who has social anxiety needs to learn something different. And so my question is, what does this person need to learn? And then I move on to the next step of how do I help them learn that thing? Some people need social skills. Some people don't. Some people need to learn how to manage that internal distress. Some people just need to work on eye contact. You know, some people I just need to teach them, if the eyes are overwhelming, focus on the nose. That's okay. You know, that's a common skill we teach a lot of people on the autism spectrum. It's a good one for social anxiety too. So what is it that people need to learn? And then how do I maximize those learning experiences?
That's awesome. So I, you know, it does sound very behavioral focused, you know, and I think that makes sense because I think, you know, we have tons of studies on CBT for the role of social anxiety. I'm curious though, what do you think about some of these like more psychodynamic perspectives and things like that? Like, I mean,
yeah. So
subconscious shadow work and all this good
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. I think there's a lot of richness and depth there in the more psychodynamic approaches. And one of my favorite training experiences, I did grad school in DC, and I did a year training at Georgetown. And the Georgetown training experience was very psychodynamic. And what I loved about that experience is my supervisor really worked on my relationship with him, my relationship with my patients, and how the stuff that my patients were bringing up was bringing up stuff in me. So transference, countertransference is a jargon term for it, but it's basically the idea that the patient coming into my office is bringing up stuff that's going to bring up stuff in me. And the relationship we have between the two of us is a great place to work on all of that. And I think that is one of the greatest gifts that psychodynamic training has provided all of therapy. And I think that doing that kind of work is very important for lots of different problems, like personality disorders. We kind of talked about that. There's a lot of value there. When it gets to social anxiety, you're going to hit a wall where the work has to extend beyond that relationship between the patient and the therapist. It has to extend beyond that. And the reason for that is there comes a point where you can't really simulate initiating a new conversation. You can't simulate the performance situations. And as we know about all forms of anxiety, they're best dealt with when it's similar to the naturally occurring context. Snapping it all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, my mom has this lifelong fear of thunder and lightning. That is one of the most difficult phobias to treat because it's one of the most difficult phobias to recreate.
Very hard to do exposure therapy. Depends on the weather.
Depends on the weather. I cannot I am not Thor. I cannot summon thunder and lightning. We have VR, which maybe can help, and sometimes it's a lot better than nothing. But what a lot of therapists have done is like pull up YouTube videos of like thunder and lightning and turn the volume up and have like the person sit with it. It's not the same. It doesn't capture real thunder and lightning has that kind of shake, that sonic like pressure that you feel, and it has a suddenness, and there's a massive light. Like it's very hard to simulate all of that. Similar thing with getting back to psychodynamic and social anxiety. If you're just dependent on these four walls, you and the relationship with the other person, you're going to hit a wall with the types of social situations you can simulate. Maybe you have a good person who is giving you some good homework assignments that you can apply yourself. Like, I want you to, we're going to text that other person right now. This is something I've done with a lot of patients. You're avoiding writing this email. Great. We're going to write it. Let's see what's coming up for you. Let's bring it to life. Let's understand the thoughts. Let's work through the social skill of how to write this email. You're not just going to say, hey, to your professor. No, you're going to say, dear professor, blah, 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 or hi, professor, blah, blah, blah. Like we work through it all. There's a lot you can do in the office that is also
in the external world.
In the external world, absolutely. I still think you're going to hit a wall. You need to get outside these. You're going to hit a wall. You need to get outside the office. We need to activate the real life, breathing social world to help you make progress in these social situations.
Oh, well, I love your answer. So it's interesting because I think a lot of people would take issue with it, but I think it's fantastic, right? I'm thinking about my own psychodynamic training.
Yeah.
And thinking about, do we ever have to cross the barriers of the four walls of our office? The psychoanalyst is terrified, right? What do you mean it can't all be solved on the couch? Like, what do you mean you have to do something in the real world? No, like
the blank slate, the protective, safe cocoon of the therapist's office. I know. Yeah.
And it's so interesting because like I said, I love your answer because I think it's super practical. I think there's a reason why we're seeing a growth of cognitive behavioral methodologies. So I think in a lot of ways, like psychodynamic progress has like stalled. I mean, I'm sure people will call me foolish for saying that and say that I don't understand what's going on, but I do think there's been some stalling. Like I don't see psychodynamic development the way that we used to have it. And I think we're also learning that people like, especially like the modern generation of, we're talking like millennials to Gen Alpha, usually want like pretty concrete results pretty quickly. They're coming here to solve problems, right? I don't want to be this way anymore. I want to be able to go to parties. I want to be able to enjoy things. Part of what I found frustrating about psychodynamic training and psychoanalytic training and stuff is that it was not clear to me like what you get and when you get it. So people, I had an analytic supervisor who was like, after 2.5 years, the patient had a breakthrough. And I'm just wondering, like, what were you doing for the first 2 years? Like, how, is there any way to accelerate this process?
Well, yeah. So one thing I'm going to completely agree with, and then one thing I feel like I need to push back on. I don't know why, and maybe we should talk about that. But I completely agree that the treatment needs to be like a machine that you can open up and see how all the parts work. Like one of my supervisors called it like CBT is like opening up the hood of the car and seeing the engine. And it's like, well, this stuff does this. And when it's all working, here's what you're going to get. Like it should be transparent. Like at the very beginning, once you have a treatment plan, it should be like, here's your problem you have. It fits this diagnosis. I think it's because of these factors in your history that you have this. These are the mechanisms. This is the engine. When this turns on, these problems come out. So we need to tackle these mechanisms, and here's how we're going to do it. All of that should be pretty clear and pretty transparent. Completely agree with you, and that's one of the things I love about this kind of work. Where I want to push back, I don't know if you've seen this on YouTube, but there is a profound interest in Jungian ideas, in shadow work, and it is resonating with people in a way that was not around when I was in training. YouTube was only a few years old when I was in grad school, but there's something about the richness of these theories that is very compelling to people in a way most of the stuff I say is not very compelling to people. And I haven't quite understood why that is, but it is a thing.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm confused. What about that is pushback to what I said?
That you said there's a lot of interest in these like very practical, like what do I do? And I think a lot of those videos that I've seen are not very practical, but there's a depth to them.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. So I completely understand kind of where you're coming from. I think I agree with you almost 100%. So I think I should have done a better job at sort of clarifying what I meant. But I think first of all, yeah, I think people. So what I've noticed is that there is a culture of lack of comfort with uncertainty. So before I buy something on Amazon.
Yes.
I'm not going to try something. I mean, I do it, right? So when I go to, when I go to a bookstore now, and I'm like, oh, this book looks interesting. Before I buy it, I will check it out on Goodreads.
Yeah.
Oh, turns out that this is just a very tempting cover, but the book is not really what I'm looking for.
Right.
Right. So there's a lot of discomfort with uncertainty. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of times there's also like concerns about the field of psychotherapy, and I think understandably so, because I don't know, people sometimes don't know what they're getting.
Absolutely.
So I kind of think that like the problem, one of the biggest problems we have with psychotherapy is the same problem that we have with spiritual gurus, which is that you don't know if the person that you're seeing is doing a good job or not. So if something is taking a year and you haven't made a big breakthrough, does that mean that you're with someone who's a dud? Or do you need to keep working harder? Are you at fault? Are they at fault? Do you need to be trying harder? Like, we don't have a good way to assess the quality of a therapist, which is the same problem with a spiritual guru. How can you tell the difference? The whole point is that when someone is spiritually not very developed, you can't spot the fake people, right? They all look the same. They're wearing the beards and the prayer beads and all that. They have the accent. Right?
Yeah.
And so that's a big challenge. So I think that I'm seeing a large amount of very outcomes focused. I did some work. My introduction to the field of coaching was at a place called McLean Hospital. Not sure if you're familiar with McLean.
Oh, absolutely. I've referred many people to McLean.
So McLean is awesome, and they started a coaching institute, and they had a psychologist who specialized in positive psychology. And I got super confused and even threatened by the field of coaching. I was like, oh, us therapists, like, what are these coaches doing? And then I realized that there's just a lot of therapists that are like, if you come in, this is what I was taught. And I don't think this is wrong. I think it's just a perspective. If a patient comes into your office and says, hey, can you help me get a girlfriend? Mm-hmm. What I was taught, my program was probably, in a sense, maybe a little bit more psychodynamically oriented, or maybe that's just where I gravitated towards. Mm-hmm. When someone comes in and says, hey, can you help me get a girlfriend? What I was taught is ask them, what makes you think you can't get a girlfriend? What are your concerns? What have been your experiences? What makes a girlfriend important to you? This is what I was taught is the right answer, right? Answer a question with a question.
It's the whole I'm happy to answer your question, but first I would like to understand why you're asking. Yeah. People hate that.
And so what I was taught is you're not supposed to say yes. and so I think that our profession has sometimes moved away from responsibility for the outcomes of our patients. I think there are good reasons for that, right? So as therapists, I can't create sobriety in someone. So I think that there's a emphasis on okay, after 12 weeks of CBT, we're going to see this level of reductions. And I think, you make such a strong case for it. Your emphasis is at some point, the point of this is that your social anxiety, you've adapted by becoming invisible, and you want to be seen.
Yes.
And even I love the way that you describe the charismatic, socially anxious person, because this too is a form of invisibility. It's like, hey, I'm going to put on this front of being this kind of larger than life, charismatic, always having a good time, because on the inside, I'm terrified of showing the person that I actually am. It's a different form. It's an illusion more so than an invisibility.
I call that the Lady Gaga effect.
Okay, yeah, great.
So in an interview with Anderson Cooper many years ago, he asked her, "What's up with all the the clothing, the meat dress that you wore to the Grammys or whatever?" And she says, "It's all attention directing. I want people to look at these things and be distracted by them, so they're not looking at my personal life." And I think that's the charismatic guy who has social anxiety.
It's such a beautiful characterization, something that I've never kind of encountered at the level that you're describing, and I think that's why it's so awesome to talk to you, because I will bet you money that, you know, somewhere between 10 and 30%, this is my gut check, of people who are extremely extroverted and charismatic also have social anxiety. Yeah. We know from studies that shyness and social anxiety on some levels are correlated, but also that shyness is a separate category from social anxiety. At least
and Dr. K, here, this is where I want to mention, it's not just a fear of negative evaluation. Sometimes it's a fear of positive evaluation. So people with social anxiety, these charismatic folks who might be doing very well, could be deeply anxious about getting good feedback, because they might fear the person doesn't actually mean it, or more commonly, I don't want to get that feedback because I'm never going to be able to do as good of a job again. Yeah. We see this with high-performing athletes. We see this with all sorts of very successful people too.
It's interesting. I'd never really thought about the connection between imposter syndrome and social anxiety before, but I think like I see that a lot. I do a lot of work with imposter syndrome. And it's a big feature, right? You fear the good stuff just as much as the bad stuff.
Yes.
Because the judgment creates an expectation that then you have to live up to, which if you don't believe in yourself becomes, it becomes untenable. Kind of going back to the CBT thing for a second, and then maybe we can move on to questions. But I totally agree with you that I think what's happened is people are looking for like kind of tighter outcomes. I think they're looking for exactly what you're talking about. And I think for a long time, the field of therapy, like it's not clear how much we were even helping our patients. Like sometimes, right? People would be in therapy for years and it's like, what are we kind of doing here?
Yeah.
And so I think that there's been a responsiveness to that, which is like, okay, I want to make changes in my life. And I think you offer something that is incredibly alluring, which is like, hey, I know it's scary, but at some point, the point of you coming to this office is so that you can go and live an ordinary life, and then recreating almost like an exposure therapy kind of approach, right? We want to have these signals be real. We want to teach you how to deal with this, not in here. We got to leave the sandbox at some point.
Yes.
And I think what I'm also seeing, I'd completely agree, is that as we focus on those kinds of outcomes, there is a lack of focus on some of these deeper themes.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say I'm more psychodynamically focused maybe than CBT focused in my practice. And, it's interesting because when you said at some point you have to leave the office, I'm not even sure I agree with that.
Interesting.
So it's and I think that just I don't think it's like right or wrong. I think it's just the kind of work that you do. And really when I think about some of these, some of the experiences that you're describing that compound social anxiety, like I was almost really thinking about everything from a trauma lens, where sure you have these original inclinations, but then this thing did happen, right? Where you jumped into the pool with your socks. And if we think about the core beliefs and the schemas that come out of that can be tracked to a traumatic injury and some amount of dormant emotion that then gets like reactivated, right? So you trigger that schema in the right circumstances. And one of the things that I found is really kind of cool is that I think you can get a lot of mileage out of like almost that traumatic sort of healing in the office. And I'm sure I know you're going to agree with this. I don't think we actually disagree at all. And then it's interesting how sometimes I've found that you don't need to do a whole lot outside of the four walls. I've had
Yes. Yes.
patients where, you know, as part of our therapy, it's like we're going to walk down the street and you want to apply for a job. We're going to walk by the place that you want to apply for. If you're ready today, we're going to go in and ask for a job application. If you're not ready, we're going to just walk down to the end of the block, turn around, and come back.
But you're leaving the office.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Totally.
with some people, I leave the office.
Yes.
I absolutely see the value of that. I absolutely see it. But I also see the flip side of, I think, what you're talking about, which is this idea of like what's going on at a deeper level.
Yeah.
And as we do some of this Jungian work, as we do some of this stuff, you know, I've had some really weird experiences with like past life trauma processing, which there are actually like some papers about and some research on and things like that, where we're like, really, I mean, that has nothing to do with going out into the world. It's the exact opposite. And I've seen therapeutic value for that.
Yeah, it's going into this world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I this is a classic. This is one of my favorite types of conversations to have with another mental health professional. Because at first it seems like we deeply agree, and then you're like, actually, are we saying the exact same thing? I think we are. I love these kind of conversations because definitely trauma can be a thing. I think the social media has made it seem more like a thing for a lot of these problems. I don't think that's the case. It gets back to that question of what does this person need to learn? And some people, we really need to work on the trauma piece. I wouldn't say the jumping into the pool was as much of a trauma as it was a confirmation of fears I had about myself. And we can kind of unpack that too, right? Like, what does that mean?
I want to one day.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the distinction I'm trying to make here is my social anxiety was not environmentally triggered. I think it was, you know, babies have a behavioral inhibition to the unknown. They press the brakes, they stop when there's unfamiliar, especially stranger danger turns on between age 1 and 2. You know, kids don't like unfamiliar people. For me, it just sort of never turned off. And then it evolved into selective mutism and then social anxiety, right? A trauma, it can be a chronic small environmental thing. Like you can have abusive parents, you might grow up in a difficult neighborhood, things like that. Or it could be specific more to a situation, but it has this profound change in how you see yourself, and how you see the world, and how you see other people. There's an overlap there with some people who have social anxiety, and sometimes there's no overlap. Similar to ADHD. Some people with ADHD have profound social anxiety. They will say things quickly, then have extreme regret over what they said, might get negative feedback, and now they feel terrible about themselves. And that can happen. Or they might do something impulsively and then feel terrible about it. Or they're forgetting meetings, showing up late, and now they're worried about the social judgment. Same thing with autism spectrum. There's overlaps here, but the difficulty and the real value in a therapist is in their ability to understand, what does this person need to learn? What does this person need to get out of this experience? How can I help this? What is this problem doing for the person? And how can I, as you really eloquently said it, how can I sort of, if this is vicious cycle, how can I stop the cycle? What's one piece of this that I can change? Because I completely agree with you. Sometimes just one change is enough to completely destroy the whole system that's maintaining this mess. The challenge is understanding what is that one piece. And I think it's very hard for people to do that on their own. And I agree with you. I think the popularity of some of these more psychodynamic approaches the Jungian approaches, is more in the rich philosophy and beliefs that I don't think we have as much in the world. And I don't know if that's because here we're getting really deep. So feel free to pull me away from this if you want to focus more on the social anxiety treatment. But I think we've abdicated leadership on beliefs, philosophy, values, morals. As we've become more secular, more disconnected, I don't think we have as much of those common shared beliefs, the kind of things that bring us together. And I think a lot of people are hungry for that, especially boys, men, and masculinity. I think we've really done a terrible job of providing leadership around what does a good man look like. And now we're going to, I'm going in all sorts of different topics here, but I think that might be some of the popularity around that type of content.
Absolutely, man. I can't help but agree more. It's so interesting. Like, I have so many responses to what you're saying, and I think going off track is like what, in a sense, what we're here for. I think you've done an amazing job, absolutely amazing, Dr. Matu, around 2 or 3 things. So the first is, I think you did an awesome job of sharing with people what the subjective experience of anxiety is like, right? So when a patient walks into your office, what have you learned after seeing hundreds, if not thousands of patients? I have no idea, but you know,
millions, like, one might say.
Right? And so, like, because I think, like you said, it's so invisible. Like, that's the biggest challenge. I mean, the big thing that I'm taking away, what I've learned from you, is I had never thought about anxiety as like an invisibility problem, because the impairments are the absence of something, right? We don't see it. These kids are not disruptive. They're the very opposite. So I was
super compliant,
right?
Rule followers most of the time.
Absolutely. We don't want to stick out. We don't want to be noticed. So we're gonna do everything to avoid notice. That means avoiding distinction. That means avoiding notoriety, right? So we're just gonna be invisible, and it's easy to ignore the invisible kid when you've got another kid who's hyperactive and impulsive and whatever, right?
Absolutely.
So I think you did an awesome job. I'm hoping that there are people out there who have never realized, like, oh, it doesn't have to be this way. I think you also did an awesome job of really tunneling down into like normal shyness versus social anxiety, and really, what's the difference? Am I just a shy kid? No, I love this idea of there's not a difference between high stakes and low stakes.
Yes.
So I don't know exactly what what your clinical experience is, but when I was training, I did a lot of work. We take call and stuff in the ED, and sometimes there would be psychologists there, and sometimes there wouldn't. So we're doing like 30 evaluations in like a 24-hour period, right? So it's a lot of like diagnostic, like, okay, what is going on? Is this person psychotic? Are they autistic? Are they anxious? Like, what are they high? Like, what's going on? And what I loved about this is I'm walking away from this with like an awesome diagnostic question, right? So we ask some of these questions like, are you a worrier? We'll ask some of these things to give us a sense of, are you seeing or hearing things that other people don't see or hear? Yeah. And the main question I'm walking away from is like, is there a big difference between high stakes and low stakes in your life? Is there go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I'll give you a faster shortcut, which is finish this sentence. I'm afraid people will think that I am, most of the time, if they have social anxiety, weird, strange, unusual, don't belong. they're going to be very quick to answer one of those questions, and
Interesting.
that will reveal the high stakes, low stakes. That every social situation feels high stakes to them.
That's awesome, dude.
Yeah.
Awesome. And then I think so. Not only that, but then I really appreciated how you went into the mechanisms. Right. So, like, let's understand not from a symptom perspective, but from a sign perspective, from a clinician, what's going on in this person. Well, they have a disrupted attention. They have a hypersensitivity to physiologic signals. They have certain core beliefs, certain schemas. They have certain adaptations. And then I think you also did like a super cool job of like going through how we approach this. Right. So, as a clinician, it's not about this particular outcome. It's like, okay, recognizing that this is in some ways a deficit of skill. In some ways, this is an atrophy of certain capabilities.
Yeah.
And that even though someone may feel busted, you're not actually busted. It's your problem, fair enough. It's not your fault. And by the way, the super cool thing is you can just learn particular things.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. And the part of this that I think is like a whole nother conversation is, so how do you start moving forward on those things by yourself? Especially if you are in your 20s and 30s, you don't have many friends, or you might live in a rural environment. You might not have a lot of social opportunities. That's a whole nother can of worms to talk about. And the quick thing I'll say about that is you can always start small and get practice and experience with real world social situations. What do people need? Well, social skills, sometimes practice with embarrassment, sometimes practice with rejections, sometimes practice with spontaneously saying things, sometimes learning how to ask an open-ended question. And my daughter, I was just talking to her about this 2 weeks ago, and she said, she's 7 years old, and she said, "Daddy, what's your favorite color?" And I said, "It's blue, purple, lavender. Those are my favorite." A couple of days later, "Daddy, what's your favorite color?" I said, I told you a few days ago, blue, purple, lavender. And then a few days later, she's like, "Daddy, what's your favorite color?" And I'm like, "Sweetie, why are you asking me what my favorite color is over and over again?" And she said, "Well, it's because I don't really know what to say, but I want to talk to you. And so I'm just kind of asking you this question." And I was like,
yeah.
"Oh, this is a social skill issue."
I mean, I think it's modeling, dude. Because
Yeah.
when people meet her, "Hi,
Yeah,
what's your name?
yeah.
What's your favorite color?"
Right.
How do
right.
people express interest in her? They ask her what her favorite color is.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, that's a great layer of this that I didn't even think about. Like my head immediately went to intervention, that this is a social skill intervention, and you kind of brought in the empathy of the context in which she lives. And so we talked about open-ended questions that don't have a yes or no answer. Like, it's a difference between asking someone, do you play Mario Kart, versus what do you like to do for fun? Or even more specifically, like, what kind of video games do you like to play, right? Like, the more specific you get in your question when you're getting to know someone, the more risk you have of that conversation not working out. So if you ask someone, do you like to play Mario Kart, and they say no, well, now the conversation's kind of dead, and it feels weird and awkward.
Yeah. So this is great. So you said, this could be something we could talk about. I have a list. Can I read it out to you?
Please.
So first is function. What is it serving? To think about anxiety in terms of have a deeper conversation and help people understand that. I mean, maybe I'm injecting my own understanding of it here, but to recognize that even the anxiety is, on the one hand, serves a healthy function, and even in its pathological form, oftentimes serves a protective function. Why do we learn to be invisible, right? So oftentimes what I find is that when I'm working with my patients, it is their adaptations to their pathology that actually create the most problems.
That is 100% true almost for every sort of problem we have in mental health.
So, I think we got to talk about that, right? So I think that's a conversation. I think this concept of an attentional shift, then the question becomes, okay, so if we're hyper focused on our own thoughts instead of externalizing. So when I work with patients with anxiety, one of the things that I notice is, kind of like what you said. I mean, I think you've already said all this. I just use different words. So when you're looking down and when your attention is in your own head, you disable the reassuring empathic circuits that you have in your brain because you're not seeing that they're laughing. You're not paying attention to what they're actually saying. So the externalization of attention, if you are anxious about something, can be incredibly helpful. So how do we shift that attention?
And one thing to add to that, Dr. K, is it's not going to be enough to shift your attention to the right things and increase that flow of information just in that moment. Because your brain is so primed to see threat that at first, when you start to shift that attention and the flow of information is pouring in, it's not enough. We need to increase more information, so more frequency of those kind of situations. And sometimes we need to overlearn because most social situations we have are actually pretty neutral. Neutral can feel like negative. So we sometimes need to go overboard and intentionally bring about embarrassment, intentionally bring about rejection, intentionally have you say the thing that you are so scared of saying, and then see what happens. It's why I wore this shirt. I
Lady Gaga effect.
Well, yeah. I always felt like this weird kid, and now I aspire to be a confidently weird adult. Like sharing the things that I think people will find weird. I intentionally try to do that, and almost 90% of the time when I wear the weird shirt, people are like, cool shirt, man. I like that. I like Ninja Turtles too. I had a patient who he was so socially anxious about his love of WWE, World Wrestling Entertainment. And so I told this kid two things. I call him kid. He wasn't a kid. He was in his 20s. I'm an old man now, Dr. K. I've become that guy.
We both are.
And both are. But I said two things. Number one, I was a big Ultimate Warrior Undertaker fan. I get wrestling. I know it. I love it. Number two, do you see all the people in the audience at the show? Do you think you're the only one who loves this stuff? Do you know how sold out these events are? How popular they are around the world? And he was like, I never thought about that. But it wasn't enough. He had to overlearn. He had to wear the wrestling shirt and initiate conversations where he shared the thing he was so deeply afraid to do, which was to express his love of wrestling and see how people react. We did that. The feedback we got is most people are like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Most people just don't care.
So I think that's another thing, this concept of overlearning, I love. And then I think you touched on a lot of other things that I think are absolutely like worth digging further into. One is this concept of the charismatic and socially anxious. And another one is being trapped by an extrovert when you're socially anxious and don't know how to set boundaries, right? And they're just like talking and you're like, I don't want to be here, but you're too anxious to like... It's interesting because my experience, one of the things that I look for like internally is like a certain stickiness with anxious people. So another thing that I've noticed is that when they do find someone that they feel comfortable talking to, it feels very sticky. Like they can come across as sticky, which is something that I think that they're afraid of. But so I think the intersection of social anxiety in these various like social situations, I think this concept of latency to respond is also like super fascinating. Right, that this is, it's not that I'm an idiot, it's not, I mean, there is freezing that goes on, but that there's actually like a latency to respond, and that is something that can be intentionally worked on.
You want to know my favorite skill for that?
Yeah.
Yes, and.
What do you mean?
Yes, and. So there's a psychologist, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he was out of Chicago and worked with Second City Improv out over there. And he learned improv skills and joined an improv team. And then he took all those improv skills and applied it to social anxiety treatment. And he created this protocol for how to weave those things together. And one of the most core skills in improv is called yes and, where your improv partner says something, sets up a scene. You never break it down. So, for example, if someone says, "Here's a Swiffer wet jet," you don't say, and someone else responds and goes, "Yeah, it's great for cleaning jet airplanes." You don't say, "No, it's actually for the floor." You say, "Yes, and this wet jet is great for your Boeing 747s." You build, you listen and you build and you add. And so for the people who have this latency problem, we will do a week in my social anxiety group that is improv skills. And what you see is in that hour time, as they are learning yes and, at first they'll be like, deer in headlights, like, and we wait, we give them time, we remind them, yes and, just build on it. Listen and build on what they're saying. And over the course of the hour, they start to just say the thing that comes to mind. Because that's what I find with the latency is flooded with anxiety, thoughts are focused on all the worries, they're not able to generate an idea. But as they become used to this anxiety and they become more intimately aware of what it's doing, then they're able to just take the risk and just say the thing that comes to mind, which is what you and I usually do in our conversations. We just say the random...
Take the risk.
We just take the risk.
Yeah.
We just say the thing, People with anxiety, they don't take the risk. And so we teach them yes and to be able to, as all good improv artists, just take the risk and see what happens.
Yeah, beautiful, right? So I think that those kinds of, so when we approach these like practical situations, you mentioned assertiveness, asking for help, right? I think there's like clearly a ton of clinical experience, lived experience, scientific understanding of studies and things like that, that like, I think it would be super cool to continue to explore. Also, like, I'm so curious about, you said, what does this person need to learn? So we talked about the value of that approach. Yeah. And I would love to spend more time talking to you about, so in your clinical experience, what are the most common answers to those questions? And right, you do such a good job of like sprinkling them throughout, like, okay, like even with the yes and, it's like, let's talk about latency. Well, here's what I learned about this. Yeah. So I love how, practical you are, because you're very behaviorally focused and functionally focused. And then there are a couple of other like wild things that I'm curious about. So one is I'm really curious about this kind of perspective on anxiety and trauma, because you said something that I couldn't pass up. I mean, I did in the moment, but I can't pass it up, which is like, oh yeah, I wasn't traumatized. It just confirmed all of the things that I thought about myself. And I was like, that's what trauma is, bro. When you believe negative things about yourself and the world tells you, yeah, like I'm a piece of crap and someone is physically abusive. That's trauma. And so I think there's a hilarious like philosophical conversation.
Yes.
I think the way that you described trauma also made perfect sense, which is trauma is what changes your perspective on yourself, right? Yeah. I'm confident in myself, and then this thing happened. Yeah. And then there's the wild stuff. Like, I'm so curious, how does a kid with selective mutism end up getting happily married? Like, what was that journey like? What is dating like? And
I'll just I'll tell you a very quick thing about that. My wife, we had lockers next to each other, all that sort of stuff. It's a very cute story. But senior year of high school, we had been dating for a few months, and I told her, I said, her name's Nguyen. I said, Nguyen, I got to tell you something today. Can you stick around after school? I need to tell you something. And she's like, yeah, can you tell me now? And I said, no, it's going to take some time. I need to tell you. The whole day, she thought I was dying. She thought I had some type of major health problem, and I was going to reveal to her that I've got 6 months to live. So after school, we're sitting on the steps, and she's like, "What is it, Ali? What's going on?" And I say, "Well, you know, um, you know how people like certain different like TV shows, and like some people like certain movies, like some people like Star Wars, and that's a thing, you know. Well, I just want you to know that like I really like Star Trek." And she's like, "Okay, yeah. And so like, what's the thing that you were gonna tell me?" And I go, I really like Star Trek. Like I'm a really big Trekkie, like the Next Generation, Picard and Kirk. Like I love them. I watch it every day. And she's like, "That's what you wanted to tell me? You had me thinking like you're gonna die." But in my head, this
High
was
stakes,
huge.
low stakes.
High stakes, high stakes. This low stakes situation, it was all high stakes. In my head, I believed she might break up with me because she knew I love Star Trek.
Yeah, so like that kind of stuff. I mean, I'd love to learn more. Like how I think it's a story that hopefully we can all appreciate, enjoy, and I imagine will be inspiring because I think kind of like you're saying, you're laying out all of the fears that I hear. That there
Yeah.
is a loss of opportunities, that there is an underdeveloped level of social skills,
Yeah.
right? And you were somehow able to bridge this gap without getting a PhD, because it
Yeah.
sounds like this happened before you were a doctoral candidate.
Yeah,
And
I learned how to deal with most of this stuff by the time all in high school is when the big changes happened for me.
right, so I
Yeah.
think like that's what's so interesting is that I'm a huge fan of clinical intervention.
Yeah.
And also in my story, I learned a lot of stuff without clinical intervention.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what we do as educators on the internet is that there's like a time and place for clinical interventions, and those are awesome. And also that there's a lot of complementary kind of DIY approaches that people can work on. And then there's the weird stuff, like what do you think about shadow work versus CBT? And we didn't even get to questions. Like we had some great cases of people kind of asking for help and stuff like that. I know we're at time and I want to be respectful of that, so we still have a ton of questions from the community and stuff like that. But I wanted to just say thank you so much for coming today. Give you the chance to kind of close out, tell us a little bit more about where we can find you. I think you do a lot of writing and you show up on podcasts and stuff. I saw your name on something that I did the GPS school series, the Glenn Bard thing.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm
And
gonna
I was
be
like,
there
oh,
in a couple
hey,
weeks.
I know that guy.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about where people can find you and if they're interested in more resources?
Yeah, totally. The big place a lot of people probably know me from is my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@DRALI at Dr. Ali will get you to me. It's been a little bit in hibernation for a while I've been focused on writing a book and that kind of stuff. If you're interested in that stuff, my new website, www.goodatanxiety.com. I'm going to be releasing a free email course with all my big ideas about anxiety in September. So if you go to goodatanxiety.com, you can sign up for it. Totally free. It's my best ideas about anxiety in 15 short stories. So if you like the story stuff, definitely go there. One of the stories, I know this was a question in the community, was about anxiety about using public restrooms. I got a story about that too. That's tied to social anxiety. It's in that email course. We'll kind of dive into it. So those are the two places. I'm on other socials, but YouTube, Dr. Ali, and goodatanxiety.com for my writing.
Yeah, awesome. So I strongly recommend y'all check it out. I mean, I think if y'all have been paying attention to the conversation and y'all have been here for a little while, like I think it's clear that Dr. Matu has a lot of what I think our community really appreciates, which is some amount of like, I've lived this to a certain degree myself, plus I did some awesome clinical training and I've helped hundreds, if not thousands of people with this. And I think he's fantastic at disseminating information. Like, you're a wonderful teacher.
Well, that's all very kind of you to say. And I think something that you and I share in common that I haven't thought about until now is we had experiences outside of traditional healthcare
Mhm.
that really changed our lives. And I'm hearing you say that now kind of reflects back to me probably why I do this kind of thing
Mhm.
is I don't believe all the changes have to happen in traditional healthcare. I do believe DIY can work. It did for me. And what I try to do now is take everything I've learned in my professional work and fast track those DIY solutions and make them doable for people. You know?
Yeah, I think I could basically copy paste that, right? So
Yeah.
I think what I found, and even the reason I started streaming on Twitch is what I found with my patients was that there was like a gap in psychoeducation. That I wasn't actually doing psychotherapy with them 50% of the time. That
Yeah.
most of what I was doing was like teaching them things. And it became a little bit scripted. And it wasn't therapy. It wasn't like practicing medicine. It's like, hey, let's understand how dopamine works.
Yes.
And so I think it was so much more efficient to have them kind of learn that stuff. And then we take those principles which they learn, and then when we have an hour for psychotherapy, then we kind of can apply those, like once you have some DIY experience, then you can kind of come in, right? And I almost